It's time to reconvene. We would like to start the panel discussion, changing East Asia situation and the significance of interconnectors in this region. From REI Director Mika Obayashi will serving as the moderator. Ms. Obayashi, the floor is yours. Thank you, Ms. Kudo. For the latter half of the program, the panel discussion, I have the pleasure of serving as the moderator. My name is Obayashi from REI. In the earlier part of the program, we heard from 3 speakers. And the second report that we published was presented. And as a Japanese business, how are we engaging in the promotion of Asian interconnector business? And how is KEPCO trying to push this project forward? And Japan as a whole and Asian countries, what is happening in terms of international negotiations between Japan and the rest of Asia for this project? Takahashi-san, Pak-san will also join the panel. And Nobuo Tanaka, chairman of Sasaka Peace Foundation, and Dr. Andrei Cherkin from Scovo Tech will also participate. And before we get into the comments by the panelists, Nobuo Tanaka, Mr. Tanaka, and Dr. Cherkin will make a few minutes of presentation. First, Mr. Tanaka, chairman of Sasagawa Peace Foundation, and the former Secretary General of the Secretary of REI will also speak. Mr. Tanaka is also advisor to our study group. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ms. Obayashi. My name is Tanaka. I look forward to spending time with you. I haven't prepared remarks, but in lieu of that, I've distributed a handout. And so basically what I have to say will be concerning this. TEPCO should return power with regard to nuclear power generation. It's a rather radical title, and it was published in the Japan Nuclear Power Academy magazine. And I am talking about the subject in different places. On television in BS Japan, Broadcast Satellite Japan, there's someone that I respect much, and I engaged in a dialogue with Mr. Ichiru, and the talk ended last week on Saturday, and I talked about this subject in a major way. There may be very few people that have looked at this program. There was very little reaction, therefore, and I'm glad. And as to why I talk about TEPCO having to return its power, abdicate power with regard to nuclear power generation. Mr. Miwa talked about mounting frustration regarding the fact that the Asia supergrid, which is an outstanding idea, has been floated in China and in South Korea and in Russia. Things are moving, whereas in Japan we're left behind. And that was what Mr. Miwa mentioned. At IEA, I was Director General, and then after having served as Director General and stepping down, in Japan, there's a grid that's connected, or in Europe, the grids are connected, and there's a system which is great with regard to the environment. But it's very unfortunate that this is not happening in East Asia, whereas it is happening in Europe. And I have been asserting this, so I understand Mr. Miwa's frustration very much. So then the government or METI, I can work on them to proceed with this, but things don't start to move, and the same with politics. And with the private sector promote something like that, we cannot hope to expect much from the private sector. How is this possible? When you think about this, maybe TEPCO holds the key to this. And in relationship to nuclear power generation, if TEPCO reforms itself in a major way and abdicates its power generation network, and then TEPCO has entered into a joint venture with Chubu, and TEPCO and JAPCO getting together to do nuclear power generation. Well, itself will buy Kansai Electric Power Company's network, and it will be the only transmission company. That would be a challenge for TEPCO to revive itself. TEPCO to be viable going forward, to abdicate, cut off its nuclear and spin off its nuclear power generation. Ever since the Great Eastern Japan disaster, a considerable time has lapsed, and Fukushima has decontaminated and has decommissioned with great effort, and we understand that. Kashiwazaki Kariwa and restarting this plant, with regard to this, tremendous efforts are being made. But to restart the Kashiwazaki is something that there is very little hope for. Maybe we should put that behind us so that TEPCO has given rise to a major accident. And maybe we should say that TEPCO is not qualified to do nuclear power generation. It's probably easier to abandon this concept. On the NHK, there is a program on Saigo, and the Tokugawa government returning power to the emperor. That was what gave rise to Meiji Restoration. Maybe politically this was irresponsible, but because of this, Meiji Restoration took place without much bloodshed, and it was a major revolution without the bloodshed, much bloodshed. And with regard to energy situation in Japan, we need to effectuate such major changes. Otherwise, we cannot find solutions to individual issues. What is very talked about, Asia supergrid, connecting Korea and South Korea and Russia. Maybe we should think about how the future of nuclear power generation along with this in terms of reducing power generation costs, and also in terms of using more renewable energy, and what to do with Fukushima, decommissioning and decontamination, how to proceed with that, energy security as a whole, how to think about this, all of these energy issues. And the solution to these should perhaps be worked out simultaneously. Unless we provide an overall solution, my thinking is that individual solutions, individual issues would not come about. It's not just about increasing renewable energy. We've introduced a feed-in tariff. The cost is going up, but the grid is not connected, so it's not going well. Nuclear power generation, we may work on this, but restarting power plants is making little headway because the general public does not understand. Debundling is something that we're working on in this major market reform. For TEPCO to remain viable is what we have to ensure. We cannot let TEPCO go under. So within this atmosphere of debundling, how do we revive TEPCO? When you think about this, TEPCO abdicating power or returning power is not a mistaken idea. METI and the nuclear industry people, I discuss with them about this issue, but nobody challenges me with regard to this point, saying I'm wrong. I believe people agree, but as Director General of IEA, I've served a long time, and ever since I was with METI, I was overseas half the time. And so as a foreigner, I'm taking the liberty of saying this. I feel that what I'm saying is not really totally off the mark. And so referring to what's on this paper, the reason I thought about this is last year, IEA announced the World Energy Outlook 2017. And in this outlook, something surprised me. IEA said that in the world, in the energy market, there are 4 major revolutions taking place. That is what was mentioned. The first was centering around North America, the shale revolution. The United States has absolute competitive advantage in oil and gas, or it's trying to have that competitive advantage. Trump, in his reckless policy, despite his reckless policy, U.S.'s competitive edge is becoming greater. And the policy goal is energy. And the second is solar revolution. And I was really surprised with this. IEA is saying that going forward, solar photovoltaic power generation would be the cheapest mode of power generation in many countries. That would probably be the case. And IEA categorically said that. They didn't say this when I was there, or until recently they didn't say that. So this is quite shocking. If that is the case, if solar becomes the cheapest, then what is to become of the other power sources, in particular nuclear power generation? On this issue, we have to think seriously about this. Large-size light water reactors or obsolete light water reactors to be replaced. Whether or not to include this in the basic energy plan has been debated a long time, and there has no conclusion drawn. But large-size light water reactors' competitive edge is waning compared to solar. And the existing nuclear reactors to restart these would be perhaps meaningful, but to replace obsolete reactors with new ones, it would be very costly, to the tune of over 1 trillion yen. So if that's the case, we cannot hope to be competitive. So economically, to introduce light water reactors, the case would be very limited. In China, the light water reactor's cost is about 1/3, but wind and solar power is, again, 1/3 of that cost. So light water reactors to be revived in a major way, I think, will be difficult. So if that's the case, what is the future of nuclear power? How are we to think about the future of nuclear power? I think we should think seriously about this. And the third revolution is the green revolution in China. That is to replace coal with natural gas. That's a major trend. And in lieu of this, there'll be a shortage of natural gas, and price has gone up. The Beijing skies are blue now. It's a deep blue now. But because of shortage of gas last winter, they were in big trouble. And using solar energy, there was a lot of talk about this earlier on. And that's one of their strategies. And the fourth revolution is electrification. To burn energy, not fossil fuel type of energy, but to convert this into electricity and to use this in a sustainable way. Electrification or digitalization, EVs, electric vehicles, or the world of batteries are centered around China. A major industrial revolution is underway, and the revolution shows that this is moving along. There's the solar revolution and the green revolution in China, digitalization and electrification. These are all led by China. That is, the U.S. is supplying shale oil or fossil fuels, and they're aiming to have energy dominance in this way. In China, of course, they need oil and gas, but they want to reduce this as much as possible. The Middle East is becoming increasingly unstable, especially under the Trump administration. They want to reduce dependence on the Middle East, and they want to turn to renewable energy, which is more convenient, and to procure this domestically. And geopolitically, that's their energy policy. They want to become a hegemon using renewable energy, whereas the United States is trying to do so using shale oil. I think this is what is underway. And when these trends are underway, what is Japan to do? And this is the challenge which Japan is faced with. For Japan alone to secure energy security or to reduce power, the cost of power is inconceivable. With China, South Korea, and Russia to interconnect with these countries is one option. To reduce energy costs is something that we have to think about. Would nuclear power have a role in this? This is something that we have to give thought to. Solar power cost is coming down increasingly. Recently, 1 kilowatt hour is less than 2 yen. And in Saudi Arabia and Middle East, this kind of solar power is available. The distributed power source in Africa or in the developing countries, these are still competitive after making very much use of that. AU has a plan to use solar in very major ways. This was unconceivable in the past, but they're trying to increase their competitive edge through that, and they want to maintain sustainability at the same time. And this is becoming possible using renewable energy. Has another important aspect. The users are beginning to have that sense. Renewable Energy 100, RE 100. It's a group of companies from 230 to 250. They want to create a business model which is 100% reliant on renewable energy. Apple, Google are members, such as Facebook, Microsoft, these famous IT companies, as well as GM, BMW, Siemens. The major manufacturing companies are also aiming to achieve RE 100. Shortly, they will be asking their supply chain companies to do the same. Renewable energy 100%, RE 100. Unless this is realized, companies will no longer be able to be sustainable as an entity within major companies' supply chain. And China is trying to use renewable energy. In Japan, there's a discussion as to whether to continue to use coal in power generation. I believe that there'll be fewer and fewer people willing to buy coal-fired power plants, and I think there'll be a reduction which will take place in an accelerated way. Listening to recent discussions, ESG and investment, ecology, society, and governance. Enhancing investment is very popular among investors. And SDG investment, investment in companies which are practicing or aligned with SDG, TCFD, climate financial disclosure is another group. In the financial market, finally, people are now discriminating companies based on these policies. On the supply side, what kind of power source will be provided will inevitably be impacted by all of this. There's no way that it cannot be impacted. I talked about China. I talked about GI, Global Energy Interconnection concept. China, with this concept, is trying to introduce renewables in the supply chain. And they want to link up with surrounding countries to create a larger market. And they're trying to supply a balanced power source. Of course, they'll be continuing to use coal. Coal will be used in the countryside. The state-of-the-art companies will be using renewables. It's not too difficult to create such a market. In Japan, we should try to link up with these groups to reduce cost. Earlier, Mr. Takahashi talked about the REI report, the recent report. 5 yen, 6 yen, it's very cheap. In terms of wheeling cost, 0.1 yen at a very cheap cost. if power can be imported, there's no way but to think of using this power. When I talk about this, people say, can Russia be trusted? Can China be trusted? Or can South Korea be trusted? Inevitably, these are questions which arise. When I was in Russia or Moscow or Beijing, they said, it's a wonderful idea. Let's work on that together. It's a positive reaction which I get. Maybe it's the nature of the Japanese people that there is obviously a bias, which is a fact. Whether a country is trustworthy or not, between countries, it's not a matter of trust. If you feel that if it cannot be trusted, Trump's administration is the least trustworthy at the moment. To try to diversify sources is the right way to go. To diversify, that's the basic principle of energy security. In Japan, there are problems on the domestic scene. That is what IEA thinks. In eastern Japan, it's 60 hertz. In western Japan, it's 50 hertz. And there's a division in the country which IEA feels is very risky. Over 10 years in the past, IEA has continued to say that unless this problem is resolved, a tremendous disaster may arise, and then Japan will be in dire trouble. And IEA has continued to maintain that. In 2011, on the 11th of March, that exactly happened. And before that, what links Russia and Japan? The power bridge concept came about. Unfortunately, against opposition from the utilities. With opposition from the utilities, this had not materialized. If that had materialized, that Great Eastern Japan disaster power shortage perhaps could have been avoided. That's 1 gigawatt, 10,000 kilometers, which exist in Japan. If the Russia power project had materialized, we could have perhaps had power from Russia, and we could have prevented a major disaster. And there may be a Tonankai earthquake, which may be followed by a disaster. And power generators in that region may be unable to supply power. If we're connected to Korea, we can prevent fully a blackout. 2 million kilometers of power generating cables. If it is connected, we would be able to reduce the risk. If we're connected to overseas, we would be able to reduce risk in case of major disasters. And that is mentioned in the reports. And I think the time has come to think about that. In the interest of time, I'd like to talk about what I would not go into the subject of how we can be reliable with regard to nuclear using small size, fast reactors to bring about regional distributed nuclear power. That is possible, as mentioned in the article. The large size, not the large size, the light water reactors, a different paradigm, a safer and a distributed and renewable energy friendly generation with very little debris, which is unique to nuclear power generation and which cannot be easily transformed into weapons. I believe this is possible. Between Japan and the United States, research has started. With France, fast breeder reactors, reprocessing research is underway. But now with the United States, we are starting research on this. East Asia, geopolitical major changes. Trump and Kim Jong-un, in the talks between them, there is about to happen, a major change in relationship with North Korea. We should involve ourselves in the denuclearization process. How can we involve ourselves? If we keep quiet, we won't be able to involve ourselves in this process. Nuclear, I think there's plutonium 700 kilometers, which can be changed into weapons. We can burn this in Japan, thermal or small size fast reactors. Maybe it could be used to burn up this plutonium, weapons-grade plutonium. That's something that Japan could propose. And we're talking about interconnectors going through North Korea to China to Russia. There was talk about that. In the denuclearization process of North Korea, there was a six-party talk, and there was an idea regarding KEDO, creating light water reactors in North Korea. And the light water reactors are no longer competitive, as mentioned before. To create this in North Korea is meaningless. For peaceful use, rather, to engage in joint research with regard to fast reactors between South Korea, Japan, and the United States, to present this to North Korea, to supply renewable energy to North Korea. Different pictures can be shown to contribute to East Asia stability and East Asia sustainability. I think this is one of the measures that can be used to create a different picture. The REI's proposal this time has many elements to it. It's a very interesting recommendation. We hope that the government will take this seriously in proceeding with its work. TEPCO should abdicate its power and return it to the government in terms of nuclear power operation. I think that would be a start and a first step to moving in a new direction. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
田中さん、ありがとうございました。
Mr. Tanaka, thank you very much. Quite a stimulating discussion. I think we can look forward to the panel discussion to follow. Next, from Russia, Skovo Institute of Science and Technology, a researcher, Dr. Churkin, is asked to take the floor. So Russia's initiative on Asia Supergrid, his thinking on the concept. Dr. Churkin, please.
Greetings from Russia. My name is Andrei Churkin. I work in Skoltek Center for Energy Systems and would like to present you my research on interstate electrical interconnection benefits and cost allocation that includes analysis of Northeast Asia. But first, let me say a few words what is Skoltek. Skolkovo Institute of Science and Technology is a new private institute located in Moscow. It was established in 2011 in collaboration with MIT, and MIT is #1 technological institute in the world. We are an international English-speaking institute with a significant share of foreign professors and students. And my Center for Energy Systems focuses on advanced mathematical methods for power systems and power markets. So I invite you to visit Skolkovo Innovation Center and my Center for Energy Systems once you are in Moscow. Regarding my report, I will briefly cover fundamentals of power system interconnection in order to explain how interstate interconnection influence power markets and how to estimate benefits of interconnection. Then I will show how cooperative game theory can be applied to allocate benefits and costs. And finally, I will present results for Northeast Asia case and for Russia-Chinese electrical interconnection. Imagine two power systems, A and B, with different supply functions. They can be plotted like this, and we see that price in power system B is significantly higher. We can also analyze other indicators, such as red regions. This is called generation cost or generation expenses. The blue regions is called social welfare. In this case of inelastic demand, it is social welfare of generating companies. And the whole area of these rectangles is called consumer's payment. Now imagine that we interconnect these two systems with a line with a finite capacity, let's say 400 megawatts, and we can see that situation in both power markets changed dramatically. And price in power system B dropped down to $35 per megawatt hour. So the first question that I would like to pose is how to estimate benefits of interconnection. And it can be done at least in 3 ways. The first way is by analyzing changes in generation cost. The second way is analyzing changes in social welfare. And the third way, analyzing changes in consumers' payment. Let's consider changes in generation cost. We can present each power system, it could be a country or a government, as an independent agent, let's say player. And you can see generation cost in each power system before interconnection. Once power systems are interconnected, there is a sum of generation costs and it is lower, so there are some benefits. And the question is how these generation costs and these benefits can be split among the players. And there is no unique explicit answer to this question. That's why we use cooperative game theory allocation tools in order to find the solution. One of the fair concepts is called Shapley value. I'm not going deep into detail, but would like to explain you that there is a need to analyze all possible scenarios of cooperation and find a marginal contribution of each player to possible coalitions. For this simple case of 2 players, there are only 2 scenarios. Players cooperate or they do not cooperate. And it's even possible to calculate this manually. So you can see the final cost allocation and the difference between generation cost before interconnection and after interconnection is called benefits. And an important result here is that once we have 2 players, it is possible to get equal benefits for them because they have equal bargaining power. But once we have more players and topology that influences the game, it's not so easy to analyze this case. Let's consider, for example, Northeast Asia. There is a growing interest to interconnect countries in the region. Here I provide a link to one of the research made by Takashi Atsuki from Institute of Energy Economics, Japan. This is the scheme that we use in our research. We launch optimization model, so-called transmission expansion planning, in order to find optimal ways of interconnection and optimal capacities. This is initial data that we use. It is a seasonal demand forecast. And we also need data about generation mix in each node and generation cost. This can be presented as a cost supply function of the power market. This is an example of data that we use for Japan as sending generation bids from the cheapest one to most expensive one. And it can be said that in most of the regimes, market price is set by rather expensive gas generators. We can plot the same picture for the entire region, and you already can see the scale of the problem. Who are the main players of this game? It is China with the greatest capacity, then Japan and South Korea. Now let's analyze the results. And the first scenario is countries do not cooperate. In this case, there will be just 2 power flows within China and within Russia. So it's optimal to build a power line to Sakhalin, but with not very significant capacity. What if all the countries do cooperate? Then this is the picture of optimal power flows. It is seen that almost all the lines are built except line 26, probably because it's too long and too expensive and there is no need in additional road of power export. You may also see the direction of power export. It goes from Russia through China and towards Korea and Japan. This is the summary of these 2 scenarios, and it can be seen that total benefit of this interconnection could be about $7 billion per year. But the question is how to share these benefits among the countries and how to allocate the cost of this capital-intensive project. Well, according to Shapley value, we need to analyze all possible scenarios of cooperation. Here you may see scenario number 1. Only Russia do cooperate with countries. This means that no lines can be built. We can calculate countries' expenses in this case and start building utility function. But we need to do this for all possible coalitions. And due to combinatorics, when we have 6 players, there are 63 possible scenarios of cooperation. Please note that scenario number 6 is called grand coalition, when all the players, all the countries do cooperate. And this is the optimal scenario for the region. Then we can calculate Shapley value and benefits for each country. You can see the benefits at the bottom of the screen. And these benefits are positive values. This means that each country is happy to be in grand coalition. But if we plot shares of these benefits, we see that they are not equal anymore. For example, Russia can claim to get up to 32% of benefits. And you may wonder why North Korea can get 1/3 of the benefits. This is because it has significant bargaining power due to its topology. North Korea can easily veto power transfer road through its territory and make Asian supergrid not effective. Under these conditions, China, for example, may consider building undersea cables directly to South Korea and take a share of bargaining power of North Korea. This is the picture also for 63 possible scenarios of cooperation. Scenario number 6, you may see, shows the lowest amount of generation cost and investments. So this is indeed the optimal scenario of cooperation in the region. What else can we see in this picture? For example, we can highlight scenarios in which Japan participates. And you can see that without Japan, it is impossible to achieve most of the beneficial scenarios. So Japan is also a very important player of this game. Here I plotted expenses in Russia, China, and Japan depending on scenario of cooperation. And I would like to explain you the issue of stability of cooperation. For example, one country, let's say Russia, can think that it is not very beneficial to be in Grand Coalition number 6. Instead, Russia can can cooperate only with China, let's say this scenario number 20, or only with Japan, and get more benefits. And in this way, there will be only bilateral coalition and not Asian supergrid project. This issue of stability is called the core of the game. And we have calculated that in this case, the core of the game exists. This means that it is possible to arrange compensations and money transfers in this way to persuade countries to participate in the Asian supergrid. So theoretically, creation of supergrid is possible. But how this result can be implemented? For example, we can, on the basis of benefits that each country can get, we can allocate cost investments in each line, using rule that each country prefer investing within its borders or close to its borders. And according to this fair allocation of investment, we can see that Japan doesn't have to invest in all the lines that is connected to it. It has to invest only a share of the total investments, and other countries such as China, Russia, and Korea are so interested in power export that they should invest more. This is an interesting theoretical result. Another application could be arranging of money transfers. You can see the direction. It goes from power importers towards power exporters. Please note that Russia doesn't get 9 billion of benefits. First, it gets payment for its generators to cover generator costs, and then it is provided additional benefits to stay in this grand coalition to participate in the Asian supergrid project. And my final slide is about Russian-Japanese electrical interconnection. There is an interest of 2 gigawatt interconnection between our countries. There are many scenarios how this can be done. And as you've seen, approximate cost of this project is about $5 billion. Let's consider the scenario that 200 megawatts is provided from Siberia to the Far East, and then 2 gigawatts go to Japan through Sakhalin. We have 2 countries, 2 governments, and we can say that this is a 2-player game. We can calculate generation costs before interconnection in each country and after interconnection, and allocate the benefits. As you remember, when we have 2 players, it's possible to allocate benefits equally. But in order to do this, in order to maintain this fair solution, there is a need to arrange the money transfer from Japan as an importer to Russia as a power exporter. And once we know the amount of money to be transferred and the amount of energy, and if we are talking about 2 gigawatts line, it could reach 17 terawatt hours per year, we can calculate electricity price. And this value can be used in international negotiations and in power purchase contract in our country. It is about $86 per megawatt hour. Concluding my presentation, there are prerequisites to create bilateral interconnections in Northeast Asia, for example, between China and Russia, between Russia and Japan. But development of the global projects such as Asian Supergrid is even more profitable for the region. And we suggest a solution how to allocate benefits and costs of this capital-intensive project. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for a very succinct and easy to understand presentation. We'd like to invite the panelists up on stage. From Sasagawa Peace Foundation Chairman Mr. Tanaka, and Mr. Andrei Turkin, research scientist at Slovenia Institute of Science and Technology, and Mr. Takahashi from Tsuru University, and Mr. Pak, please. Director General of Power System and Planning Department, Head of Supergrid Team, Korea Electric Power Corporation. In the first half, we had presentations, and Mr. Tanaka and Mr. Turkin gave presentations. I think there were several points which came out as a result of this. As mentioned before, the Asia Supergrid International Conference was sponsored by ourselves several times. If we look at conferences based on the grid 4 times in the past, and 2 times, 3 times in Korea, conferences based on this theme had taken place. And every time reports have come out. This is one progress, and we've made such reports. Inevitably, the discussion becomes very diverse. How to do this politically? Various studies have shown, as the study from Skorvo Institute shows, there is technological issues, and this is now possible. But why are we making very little progress? Discussion stops there. Looking back at the interim reports, let me offer the following. Last weekend, I was in Niigata Prefecture in Murakami City, and they're doing offshore wind power, and the gate interconnection is very difficult, and so they have become bogged down. And offshore wind power or submarine cables, or Niigata is all working on that, and they're very much interested in international connections. And these local governments have a high interest, but there's very little progress being made, and that's the issue. And when I talk about this, what has been mentioned before, it goes back to what has been mentioned before. What's happening overseas? People ask me very frequently as to what's happening overseas. In the interim report, we've talked about the situation in Europe, and this is what it is. Is this it? And this is, although we have not had the person take the podium, Global Energy Interconnection has come out with Global Energy Interconnection concept. And this is from KEPCO. It's a proposal from KEPCO. And Russia's is perhaps the only entity when tying Korea and Japan. There's China and Japan, and then there's going through Korean Peninsula. There were these 2 routes. Recently, Bloomberg talked about 2050 power mix and the scenario. And this is the prediction according to Bloomberg. This is a bottom-up approach, and this has predicted for each country. If the interconnector comes onto the scene, what happens? This is not included included in the prediction, but 2050, according to Bloomberg, is such that the renewable energy, solar and wind power would supply about 50%. And then if we add hydro, over 60% would be renewable energy. And as Mr. Tanaka mentioned before, this kind of a world would appear in 2050. If Japan remains disconnected and is not interconnected and continues to say it's very hard to introduce renewable energy, I don't think this is a situation that I can imagine. At some point in time, Japan will connect with other countries, and Japan itself will introduce renewable energy in a major way. And I think that's the future that's possible. This is present-day Japan. The general power transmission and distribution companies, and this is the mix. Fossil fuels account for a lion's share, and we need to make major changes there within this portion to increase renewable energy. And if we think about this, we have to increase flexibility of the interconnectors, and that is very important, I think. And this graph is from 2010 to 2017, Japan's power. How has it changed from 2010 to 2017? The upper portion is what increased, and the lower portion is what decreased. There has been a large reduction in nuclear, but we have made much progress in terms of energy conservation. Gas and coal has increased, which has been offset by energy conservation. We've seen an increase in wind and solar power generation. And going forward, we believe there'll be more of an increase in this area, that is wind and solar. And this is in Japan, increasing this power source, and we're reducing the cost. And this is what this talks about. The cheapest solar is competitive with fossil fuels. On the other hand, if we compare ourselves with other countries, Japan's renewable energy price range is still very high, and that is the reality. China, India, and Japan, Germany, UK, Brazil, Chile, and the United States. And in terms of solar and wind, Japan is head and shoulders above the others in terms of cost. In order to introduce this cheaply, interconnectors. That is, of course, we have to increase flexibility of the domestic grid, but to use interconnectors to transmit power to each other is very important in Japan. Kyushu Electric Power Company, within the service area, 80% to be supplied by solar. That's a number which has been calculated. On the domestic scene, if we can use inter-regional interconnectors, and we can use that for Honshu, and if we can connect to Korea, then Korea's renewable energy percentage can also be increased. So these changes are happening right before us, beneath our feet here in Japan. And as you know, in Japan, 3 weeks ago, a new basic energy plan has been one which the cabinet has decided on. 230 power supply. Renewable would be 22 to 24%. And this has been no change compared to the last time basic energy plan was formulated. In the basic energy plan, what Mr. Takahashi referred to, that is international interconnection, is the first. It's the first time that has been mentioned in the basic plan. But when we look at people's awareness in the world, this fluctuating renewable energy price is acceleratingly coming down, and it's penetrating and penetration of 80% is very much talked about. But flexibility of interconnectors is not a point on which there's much awareness here in Japan. That's my personal feeling. So, government's awareness. And what practically the businesses can do, or other countries' awareness. From that perspective, we want to conduct a panel discussion. First, Mr. Takahashi and Mr. Park, you've heard Mr. Tanaka speak, and Mr. Turkin has also spoken. Having heard them talk, or others have given very stimulating presentations. And Mr. Park said in Korea, things are already underway. So what is your impression having heard that? And Mr. Park, you've looked at our studies and other stimulating proposals. I believe Mr. Tanaka's proposal was very stimulating. So could you comment on these, please?
Thank you. In October last year, I had an opportunity to go to Seoul. There was a symposium on Interconnectors, which was hosted by REI. So it was held in Seoul, Korea, and I made a speech there. So it's close to a year ago when I did that, and I had a chance to talk with people from KEPCO. They were very serious, and they said that there's no choice but to have international grid connection. With the Moon Jae administration coming to power, there's increased political leadership, it seems. And there may be pros and cons about this concept, but the president has taken leadership in promoting this. And they cannot continue to rely on fuel fossil. They cannot increase it, so they will have to increase renewables as Korea. As it turns out, when it comes to renewables, Korea is at a disadvantage compared to Japan in terms of wind power generation and solar power generation. Korea's conditions are less favorable compared to conditions in Japan. But South Korea has stronger political leadership, and perhaps this came as out of the blue for the people of Korea. But then President has decided, and that is why the officials from KEPCO were so serious as they discussed this project with me. They said that they have no choice anymore but to have international grid connections. That left me a very strong impression. Technically speaking and economically speaking, it's feasible. There's no room for challenge there, it seems. In our report that we published this time, the results are concurrent. And around the world, international grid connections are happening. And so there's no doubt that that can happen. And Japan has always said that it's a trade-oriented country. We are a country that is sustained by international trade. We export as well as import. We have both exports and imports, and that is what sustains our country. And we import so much energy as a country. And given that we are an energy importer, we should think of doing more of that with power. I think we have come to a point where we have to make a decision to import and export power, electricity power. And we try to persuade the government officials with logic. And they have, however, yet to say, yes, we will make a proposal. I think we need political decision. Political leaders need to make a decision. As Ms. Obayashi said, I think we have come to a point where we need stronger political leadership and political decision. Those are my comments. And as was presented earlier, KEPCO, Korea Electricity Power Corporation, well, they've made their political decision, and they are a state-run electricity corporation, so they must be in a position that is affected greatly by political leadership and political decision. In the last 2 years, what has happened and what has led to the political decision? How have they been impacted by the political leadership in Korea? Those are the questions that I would like to raise to KEPCO. Thank you.
How about you, Mr. Park? Moon Jae-in government is such that President Moon has promoted Asia supergrid even before he became president. That's a fact. KEPCO has for a long time, even before this, talked about interconnection. And at our symposium, people gave presentations to that effect. But it was a six-man operation. But now the room has been enlarged. There are now 12 people working on the interconnection. And so you're very positive about pursuing this as a business. I think that's the present status. So could you comment on this, please, Mr. Park?
Actually, KEPCO has been studying for this project for about 10 years, less than 10 years. But before the President Moon Jae-in, the progress of this project is very slowly progressing. But after Moon Jae-in, we have some big background. So my organization has been extended to 12 persons from. At first, it started 5 or 6 persons a long time ago, but recently, by the government power, our organization department decided to enlarge our department to 11 persons. So actually, Korea government is ready to discuss with the neighboring countries to cooperate the supergrid in Northeast Asia. To be honest, it's my personal opinion. It can come true in the near future. So the most important is the government's will, especially our president's will is very important factor for us to propel this project. And the most important factor is VIP's will, and according to VIP's rule. And actually, the government officer in my Korea is ready to propel this project. We call it very aggressive project for us to start with this point. That's my question. It's your question. It's my answer to your questions.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you. One more point. Earlier, Mr. Tanaka pointed this out. And I did not include this in my presentation, but huge change is underway in the Korean Peninsula. In Japan, in the press reports, it's hard to truly understand the impact of the change happening on the peninsula. 2 weeks ago, I traveled to South Korea. I have friends there who've been engaged in renewables, those who are against nuclear power, and they have now become high-ranking government officials, and I talked with them. From DPRK counterparts, they're receiving SNS messages. In the Soccer World Cup, South Korea team did very well, and they were commended by DPRK officials. So human-to-human, person-to-person, interpersonal relationships are there. Perhaps some political leaders may not be trusted, but if we want peace on the peninsula, we need to go through various steps, and we need to start somewhere. For example, this project, of course, there may be doubts, there may be misgivings, but amidst all of that, we have to try to cooperate with each other. And that's the kind of atmosphere that I felt on the Korean Peninsula as I visited South Korea 2 weeks ago. So what is reported in the Japanese press report was somewhat different from what I actually felt on the Korean Peninsula. And I wouldn't say that I'm completely in agreement with Mr. Tanaka's suggestion. DPRK's plutonium burned in Japan. I question that concept. But as the peninsula is denuclearized and economically revitalized and its economy stabilized, electricity power is a must for DPRK. And with Keido, there was failure with nuclear power. Nuclear power is not an option. And of course, fossil fuel power, coal-burning power, is not an option either. So renewables have to be introduced, and the infrastructure for that needs to be developed too. And Japan is not in the loop for that discussion. And China will probably be more deeply engaged, more aggressively. And I think Japan still has a business opportunity that it can capture. The U.S., of course, sees the opportunity as well. Because of the geographic distance, U.S. may not be able to have interconnectors, but they see a business opportunity on the Korean peninsula to revitalize the economy on the peninsula. There are chances that the U.S. may be involved. And I think this is consistent with what was said earlier. And so we see a situation today which is completely different from a year ago, which is even different from what we saw 6 months ago. So renewables cost is coming down so fast, it's expanding very much. I think we need to renew our awareness on that. So Tanaka-san and Andre-san, could you kindly comment on what I've just said?
I agree with you completely on that point. North Korea and South Korea, the integration of the two countries, unification will proceed naturally without us doing anything. Trump and Kim Jong-un signed a short announcement. North Korea and the United States in the Korean Peninsula will look toward a only long-term peace regime, the unique long-term peace regime. The regime is in singular, not plural, and this expression appears 2 times. And I believe this signifies a unification of North and South Korea. And when this happens, to connect transmission lines or pipelines is a conceivable option. And as the moderator has just spoken, to use renewable energy is the politically correct solution. I believe what was interesting about what Andre said, that Japan, by joining the interconnector, will reduce the cost. How is it that when Japan participates, the interconnector cost will go down? Regardless of Japan's participation, you said that rather than saying you will proceed, you said that if Japan participates, it will benefit everyone because it will reduce cost. If a model makes this possible, that's very interesting. It's not just cost for Japan, and Japan will benefit from this. That is what was explained. I thought this was very interesting. That explanation and that model, if that is explained in Japan, I believe that it'll mean geopolitical contributions from Japan. But not only that, if we can explain that it will benefit Japan too, that would be a very interesting thing.
Yes, thank you for your comment. So thank you for your comments. You've asked a lot of questions. So first, I also agree with your opinion that political question is the most important one, and there is really a need to make Korean Peninsula completely safety, and this will be the greatest achievement of maybe the century, especially if we interconnect the countries electrically also. Then regarding the question of effectiveness of interconnection, I showed in one of my slides bar charts. It was a sum of expenses of generation costs in all of the 6 countries, and it is seen that when all of them do cooperate, it's possible to get the lowest cost. So it's like a theoretical result that when all the 6 countries cooperate, it's the optimal solution. And if Japan or if North Korea do not cooperate, it's not possible anymore to transmit power to Japan, for example, or to South Korea. Or this amount of power, export power, will be restricted somehow, and the optimal scenario couldn't be achieved. So it's very important to have good political relations between countries, complete trust on this energy question, and interconnect countries in an optimal way.
Thank you very much. With regard to the 2 comments, Mr. Takahashi, do you have a comment on that? liberalization of power is something that I was supposed to have studied. Power liberalization is such that it's interesting is that the larger the market, the better. In Japan, we had 10 service areas or 10 markets for power, including Okinawa. But to open up, break down the walls to do the transaction, cost will be reduced and the options will be increased. It's not just the economical benefits. If we transmit over a broad area, it would contribute to stable supply. That is, as a person that has studied power liberalization for a long time, that's the very starting point. And if you think in this way, this interconnection is a very natural progression. That is in Japan. Finally, retail has been completely liberalized, and by 2020 we'll finish unbundling, and we've reached that stage. And finally, the entire country is seeing a breaking down of the walls toward unification. And so it's a natural progression that we should connect to foreign countries. And as Andre mentioned, his concept is a very rational simulation result. And if East Asia, the whole of East Asia is involved in this, there will be large benefits economically. And not only that, as I stressed earlier, it will contribute to stable supply. Well, some may say you can't trust this country, or this country may stop transmitting power. Rather than that, if we are connected to a plural number of countries, and if we're networked, I think this will be a positive in terms of stable supply. Presently in Japan, we have zero option to have power supply from overseas. If we could increase that, even in a small way, it'll be a positive toward the stable supply. There are economic benefits and there are stable supply benefits, which both will be fulfilled. So that is what this option offers. And I was able to confirm that from the previous speaker's interventions. Thank you.
パク室長いかがですか。
Mr. Park, any comments from you? No?
I know each countries have been studying for this supergrid project, but it needs much money, some kind of huge money. So we should further study for win-win project for two countries or between two companies. We should, detailed study needs to be carried out for this project, and plus intergovernmental cooperation could be achieved. I think it is the most important factor. The most of all, as a utility workers, we should study it very cautiously. We need to be a lucrative project. It's a win-win project for countries or for companies. So we need to detailed study need to be for the next stage. That's it.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. Mr. Miwa talked about this in his last part of the presentation. What will Japan do? It's a political question, I believe. The surrounding countries have government-private cooperation to promote interconnection. I believe there's no one here to respond on behalf of the Japanese government. But I believe that one factor is amidst changes in the Korean Peninsula, for Japan to get itself involved, Japan to make business contributions. And in addition to that, through interconnection or through interconnectors, so that Asia can become interdependent. This will be a contribution to peace. And I believe that Japan should work to promote that kind of negotiation. I feel strongly about this. Actually, in China and in Russia and South Korea, in this way toward North Korea. Of course, there's talk about the gas pipeline, but with regard to power and energy, an MOU regarding cooperation has emerged. So, Andre or Mr. Park, do you have any comments on this fact?
That is difficult.
May I say a few comments about your new report? First of all, I liked it very much. And it's very good that you estimated preliminary cost of the interconnection. But as I see, there is a need to also estimate benefits for Japan as a country. Even by now, you have at least two options to interconnect to Sakhalin or to Busan. If you have, let's say, money right now, which project you should perform the first? That's why you need to understand what are the benefits for Japan. How much is it ready to pay for exported energy?
わかりました。私どものスタディ
So, comments for a study report. Thank you. Takahashi-san, any comment back on that?
In terms of benefit, there is economic benefit and social benefit. There are both. In my talk earlier, in the interest of time, the economic benefit, whether investment is recoverable, that's the only part that I addressed in the report, which, by the way, has an English translation available. The social benefits are also referred to. There has been a vetting of the earlier research, and it has been summarized in it. So if I were to explain from that perspective, stable supply, contribution to stable supply, it's very difficult to quantify, but planned rolling blackouts or demand-supply tightness, which we experienced in 2011. And after that experience, it's important that we have a reliable power source or a transmission network. To what extent this is important is something that we keenly made aware of. Mr. Tanaka talked about the northeast frequency converter and the smallness, thinness of this. And the government is trying to double the size along with the utilities, and the backdrop to this effort has just been explained. So in terms of benefit, the network will contribute to stable supply, and it would also contribute to international cooperation. The renewable energy expansion is another area in which there'll be a contribution. It's an extension of what I was talking about before, wind and solar, fluctuating renewable energy. When we are in difficult times, we need to import. But in Kyushu, they're talking about exporting. If rather than to curb output, they want to export power. It's much better if they can export, and economically they will benefit from this. For Japan to export, the possibility of that is fully possible, and it contributes to economic benefits, and it will increase renewable energy exports without curbing the output. So it enhances the percentage of renewable energy. So that's another benefit.
Thank you. Mr. Park, any comment on this?
I think this conference is very meaningful, and if it is possible, at the next time, the government officer from the Renewable Energy Department could be participating in this conference. I hope personally. Thank you.
Well, actually, in March this year, we had a workshop meeting, and we invited METI officials. They spoke about the progress made in renewables in Japan and their future thinking. This time, well, as I said, in the government's basic energy plan, there's mention about interconnectors. So they are making progress. And we would like to, of course, continue informing the government officials to encourage them to talk more. When we published our report this time, NHK, the broadcaster, gave a report about this, and we got a phone call from METI asking whether the report that we published was true. Yes, of course, we said. Our report was not a secret. It didn't come out of any vacuum. But then the media report proceeded, and so we had to apologize, saying that we will bring the report to METI soon. But we have always been submitting our reports to UNRI, the energy agency, and they are reading our reports. They send questions to us. We're answering their questions. So we're engaged in continued discussions with the government officials. And the government is saying that it carefully needs to consider interconnections. And I do hope that they will be more positive on this concept. And we would like to continue to inform the government for that. Tanaka-san, anything on this? I'm sure a lot of people are having frustrations. So the next 30 minutes, we would like to take questions from the floor. But before we open the floor, anything from Tanaka-san?
Indeed, in the Energy Basic Plan, very careful planning studies are necessary. I think this is obviously negative. What is this careful, discrete studies that's being mentioned there? I'm not optimistic, but it's a fact that it's in there. The REI's activities and SoftBank, and then there's a Asia Supergrid, which has been proposed, and they are working together. And that's why it was written in the report. So that's epoch-making in that regard. As I mentioned earlier, it's not from the supply side, but from the demand side. Renewable energy will be required in land in large amounts, RE100, or ESG investment. I believe there'll be pressure from these sources, which will be stronger, probably. The companies launched RE100. SoftBank has not declared this, but in due course, E.ON is pursuing this path. Recall the same. Daiwa House, the Sekisui House, and large companies are going in that direction. If Toyota declares, I believe a considerable number of Japanese companies will have to follow suit. And so it's just a matter of time. We have to increase renewable energy considerably. There'll be demand placed from the demand sources. Then the power market reform. Domestic renewables will not suffice, so we'll have to import. And if it's cheaper, naturally people will say we need to import. So pressure from the demand side, I think, would be effective.
Well, thank you. Earlier, well, this was mentioned by Miwa-san. But Climate Change Initiative, Japan Climate Change Initiative, JCI. We are a part of the secretariat of that, WWF, CDP. Together with these organizations, we run the secretariat for JCI. On the 6th of July, we actually had a press conference to inaugurate the activity. And we have reached out to companies that we're close to. We were able to get sign-ups by 100 companies. And Hitachi, which provides the chairman of Keidanren, is now part of this effort. So many large Japanese companies have made declarations that they need to embrace renewables more. And it was reported by the media quite widely. And right after that, 30, 40 companies have followed suit, saying that they want to join JCI. Mr. Son himself from SoftBank said that he would like to be very much part of it. So they were amongst the first members of JCI. It's good to participate in campaigns, but in the case of SoftBank, SoftBank, as an energy operator, they have decided to increase renewables. So perhaps that is one option, to be an energy operator itself. And as Tanaka-san said, the Japanese business community is increasing its awareness for ESG. Otherwise, they will not be chosen by the international supply chain. Without embracing renewables, they will be left behind. Many Japanese companies are starting to have a stronger awareness of that, a stronger sense of crisis. Mr. Bloomberg was impressed by our effort. He's been tweeting about this many times. And so across different sectors, across different industries, Japanese companies have started to take action to mitigate climate change. And so I hope we can continue expanding JCI membership. Now, at this moment, we would like to open the floor for questions. At this moment, well, toward the end, people tend to be more active, raising their hands. And please raise your hand and state your name and affiliation for questions. But please state one question at a time. We will take one question per person for the time being. We're passing the microphone around.
Nagata from Energy Strategic Studies Institute. If there's a large international network in terms of security, in terms of network stability, I think it's a good thing. If we assume that such an integrated grid is in place, would cheap renewable energy come to Japan? I think that's a separate matter. That is, if we look at the diagram, Mongolia and Russia, that's the source of energy, and energy flows from there. According to what I heard, whether it's China or South Korea, they do want, they're coveting renewable energy. Maybe they'll take it away. It won't come to downstream. They'll take it before it comes downstream. And FOB price is about 5 to 6 yen, you said. Would people be willing to sell at that price? There has to be a guarantee. Otherwise, Japanese businesses will not invest. If it's the central government doing it, it's a separate matter. But as businesses, what the price is and what the lot is, they need to know that before they're willing to invest in the transmission line. And that would be the ordinary reaction. For the private sector businesses, that's their way of thinking. That might prove to be a bottleneck, and things might get bogged down. Could I have your comments on this, please? Basically, I want to have Mr. Takahashi, Vice Chair, respond. But if people could supplement. I could only present part of the story. On the North America project, there's an Atlantic link. Canada's power utility is planning this, and the Canada's power utility is such that it's not like the Japanese general transmission and distribution companies. It's a smaller company. The Canadian size hydro and wind power generation utilities, they entered into contract to secure the power source. That's the power generating part. And then transmission lines will be newly constructed, and they will construct the transmission lines to bring power to Massachusetts, to Boston. And they said that the total cost will be such and such. And a 20-year power purchasing agreement would be used to pay. In the end, this did not materialize. It was not passed, but it was very specific, and it was very doable, realizable in terms of plan. And they were willing to invest. But such cases are increasing on the increase in North America. And that's close to the model that I referred to earlier. individual the Russian companies would do that. We are a study group, so we did not negotiate, but this is closer to the generation suppliers dedicated line model. On the Amur River, there is a hydropower station, and in Sakhalin, there is a wind power generation plant. Having studied that is how we came up with the hypothesis. As what you mentioned is very correct. When you start a business, who will do it and how much and the amount and the contract will have to be concluded. And in 20 years, how much will be sold for what price? We need individual negotiations, and it is exactly as you pointed out. But if we take the example of North America, it's not a pie in the sky. It's specific, and I'm convinced that it's not a pie in the sky. And from Mongolia, will there really be wind-generated power, non-fossil fuel, renewable energy value, how that's internationally transacted, and what the kind of certificates will be created so that it is ensured that what has been generated in Mongolia will be sold in Japan. This is something that we need to create international rules about separately. And at the study group, we did not discuss that far. And this study group will continue to talk. So from what I hear, so the natural renewable energy value and international transaction is something that we'd like to study going forward.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor, please? My name is Itsumi from Retech Japan. From a slightly different perspective, let me say the following. And this is based on ambiguous memory, sorry, but in Russia, vis-a-vis Japan, there's LNG pipeline that goes through Sakhalin. I think there's been that project being promoted. And I don't remember how the Japanese government has been dealing with that. But the Russian government has that project. But this time, what was introduced was a supergrid project. So there are two projects. Which is likely to be promoted more by the Russian government, I wonder? Considering natural resources, looking at the situation in Siberia, perhaps Russia wants to push for Russia's LNG more, so it would perhaps want to invest more in LNG rather than supergrid. If you could answer. Mr. Churkin, Dr. Churkin.
Yes, thank you for a question. I cannot answer for the Russian government, but I would explain my point of view. Yes, the projects that you named can compete. There is an option to build an undersea gas pipeline or build an undersea cable. So they compete in some sense. But which project would be preferred by the government? First criteria is that we already export a lot of gas to Japan. Is there a need to export more? I'm not sure about this. And Russia exports gas everywhere, to China, to Europe. I believe that Russia would like to find another niche of export, and international electrical energy export is a good opportunity. So I think that electrical interconnection has more chances to win in this case. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。田中さん、コメントされます。
Mr. Tanaka? Yes, indeed. What priorities Russia has is not very clear. On the Japanese side, these are people that are different from the people that are talking about the pipelines and interconnection. Which is more feasible? It's a difficult point. Russia is emphasizing Yamal. It's the North Pole Sea project. It's the Arctic project hegemony. I don't go so far as to say hegemony, but there's a strong intention on the part of Russia. Now, the pipeline and grid, which is better? As Mr. Churkin said, it's a cost comparison that you should do to see which is cheaper. From the Russian side, say Hokkaido Electric Power Company is bought by Gazprom and to provide power. That business model may be possible if that works. And domestic LNG or gas demand is such that there's enough supply to fulfill demand. So there's no desire to buy anew. And that's why with regard to pipeline project, there isn't a strong desire on the part of Japan. If we look at the European case, indeed, in different forms, gas comes to Japan. And it's not just pipeline, it's not just LNG, there's pipeline and there's competitiveness. And if we think about the price, it's very advantageous. So Japan should be more positive about promoting the pipeline. And Japan's business is such to buy through the pipeline, to buy LNG, or part of what we import would be re-exported, would be sold to growing Asia. Unless we come up with that kind of a business model, the demand in Japan will continue to decline. So as a business, it will not viable. The gas majors are such that we have international oil measures, but among the international gas majors, if Japan wants to engage and participate, they have to look at, Japan has to look at Asian consuming countries in creating a business model. Otherwise, they cannot hope to be viable. And the pipeline option is a valid one, I believe. It's sufficiently possible. Thank you.
I'd like to add that gas pipelines do not pave a way for renewable energy. Only gas can be transported, and this is not renewable. And once we build a cable, we can transport any type of energy from hydropower plants, from renewables, and so on.
いかがでしょうか。あちら、
I saw a hand over there. Further questions, please. My name is Okamoto, Japan-China Business Promotion Association. I have a question of representative from KEPCO, and I have this for Tanaka-san as well. In today's presentations, what I felt was that international power transmission, can it really be relied upon in cases of emergencies in particular? I was worried about that, but Mr. Takahashi said that it's exactly the opposite. In an emergency, we will have the option of getting supply from outside of Japan. I was made aware of that. So inclusive of that, here's my question. In May this year, Japan-Korea-South Korea summit meeting was held, and from China, Lee Keqiang came. And I hear from the press report that there could be another summit meeting amongst the three countries by the end of this year. So CKJ summit meeting, in relation to this supergrid concept, I wonder if Korea has made any official proposal. And there's no SGCC representative today, but the next meeting that will be held will have China as the chairing country. So I wonder if China will make a proposal on this. So any idea about that, raising this at the CKJ summit meeting level?
パク室長、お答えいただいてもよろしいでしょうか。
Mr. Park, may I ask you to respond? Is Korea prepared to make a proposal at the summit level meeting?
Actually, last month there was a summit meeting in Japan, China, Korea, and China, South Korea, and Japan. Actually, Mr. President Moon Jae-in proposed the supergrid cooperation with the Japan ministers, but I heard that they didn't reply the Korea's question or Korea's proposal, but it's not sure. But actually, the President Moon Jae-in proposed, but he didn't answer the question. Actually, China's government wants to cooperate with Northeast Asia, China, South of Korea, and Japan. Actually, nowadays, recently we cooperate with China, but the government of Japan is not positive so far. That's what I know. Yeah,
少々補足させていただきますと、先日の
If I may add, recently between Japan, China, and South Korea, not at the conference, not necessarily at the conference, President Moon, when Prime Minister Abe was there, Eastern Economic Forum, this was floated, and Putin also directly talked about this. That is within the political framework. Mongolia, China, Russia, and South Korea at the head of government level, they are very positive about working on this project. It's a fact that they are all positive. That is a fact. Other questions? My name is Nakagawa from Nagoya University. I'd like to raise my question directed to Mr. Takahashi. In Russia and in Mongolia, if a transmission line is laid and we bring power from these locations, it needs to go through North Korea. I believe the transmission line needs to go through North Korea. And in the present studies, is North Korea involved in studying this project, or is there a possibility that North Korea could be involved in the studies? You talked about OBOR, which is led by China. The OBOR and the AIB, Asia Infrastructure Bank, World Bank, or Asian Development Bank is in cooperation through the OBOR project, One Belt, One Road project. In relation to this, is it true that the supergrid is being studied under this framework, or is it worthy of studies under OBOR and Asian Development Bank?
So in the earlier part of the question, you asked about DPRK's potential involvement. At this moment, what our study group is studying is between Japan and Korea, Japan and Russia. About SGCC, KEPCO, SoftBank, on the other hand, at the business level, have been pursuing various options, including a Russian counterpart. They have been working on a project. And from what I hear, going through DPRK rather than that, going through China and South Korea. So have direct connection between China and South Korea. I think the distance is 500 to 600 kilometers from Santon Peninsula to Seoul. That was to be the route. Mongolia, China, and Korea will be linked, connected in such a way. That is the basic concept. And each country, as was mentioned, has various ideas, although they're called differently. And as one of the ideas, Russia and Korea to be connected with each other. In that case, of course, one option is to go through DPRK. In the last few months, given the political changes, and perhaps I should defer to Mr. Park for further comments on this, but I think as a more realistic idea, from Russia or from China, to connect to South Korea via DPRK. Such an idea has been floated, from what I hear, as a more realistic idea given the recent changes. So it's not where the network ends. Of course, there are externalities that have impact on networks. So of course, we have to look at the economics, but there are many options for routes, and the more the countries connected, the better, the more robust the network will be, and the more interconnected the markets will be. So greater effects can be derived out of that if more are connected. And the second part of your question about OBOR. OBOR basically is a policy of the Chinese government. And as part of the OBOR policy of the Chinese government, global interconnection, they are trying to promote that as part of OBOR. And the Japanese government has expressed its intent to support China's OBOR. And LNG Belt, for example, South Korea has its own initiative leading the way. President Putin in Russia has Energy Bridge as a concept. So each country has its own vision, its own idea, taking leadership. And amid such circumstances, South Korea can achieve cooperation with DPRK, and ultimately it may be realized.
Mr. Park, with China at the government, top leaders of the government, you have already discussed and you're already implementing, from what I hear, submarine cable is being laid. Will you first work on the submarine cable? Is that what you'll do first?
Actually, there are 3 lines HVDC in Korea Peninsula, inland to Jeju Island. So we have experience operating for about 10 years, but actually in Korea, the HVDC technology is not perfect so far. But we can use other countries' technology. But most important is the political situation. So it depends on the situation around neighboring countries, China, Russia, or Japan. But nowadays, the working group with the China group held about 3 or 4 times so far. We think the priority is very important, but now we think the interconnection between China and Korea is the first. But it can be changed. It can be started with Japan or China, but nowadays we are considering the priorities between the Korea and China. But the other person told us the interconnection between Korea and Japan can be the first. So don't worry. Which project will be the first? China to Korea or Korea to Japan? It depends on the situation. That's our concept. What we imagine the supergrid in the nearest Asia, Northeast Asia.
ですので、今ノースコリアと
So going via DPRK, that was not mentioned. No. So at this moment, submarine cable directly connecting between China and South Korea without going through DPRK, that is the current concept.
I don't have comment on the DPRK situation. I'm a utility worker. I'm not a politician. I'm a government officer. So for the DPRK situation, I don't have any comment. Sorry.
でも先ほど
But then, as I said earlier, well then, Japan will be the only country left out. That's inconceivable in 2020. So at some point in the past, Japan will have to be connected with the Asian continent to import renewables. That's my conviction. I think we can take 2 more questions. So 1, 2, 3, 4. You have your hands raised, and your questions will be taken. My name is Nagai. 1 gigawatt, 2 gigawatt. compared to the total capacity of 250 gigawatt, we're talking about very small volumes. And I'm being a bit negative. But it may be a benefit for someone who installs the capacity, but as a country, are we really going to benefit from this project given the size is very small, 1 gigawatt, 2 gigawatt? Let me take another question. My name is Maekawa. Well, business-wise, it's feasible, it says, but conversely, so 2 yen per kilowatt of power generated in Mongolia, how much are we going to pay as Japan? Transmission costs, how much per kilowatt hour is incurred? And I wonder what the assumptions are when you say that it's business-wise feasible. So let's take 2 questions. First, answer them, and then move on to 2 other questions. So 2 gigawatt, you may say that it's pretty small. That was the question. I agree. 250 gigawatt power plants. So given that 1 gigawatt, 2 gigawatt is small, there are many interconnector projects, and 2 gigawatt actually is the average size. It's a normal size, if you will, for a project to be started from now on. And I think it's appropriate to start from that range of 2 gigawatt. Starting from 10 gigawatt interconnector, we can't have just one single one of that, so we need multiple lines. And having multiple lines installed at the same time, that's riskier. So given that, first and foremost, we have to be certain that we can recoup the investment. That's the kind of project that we need to start with. And from the viewpoint of security concerns, the project needs to be less problematic, and that's the range that we're starting from, 2 gigawatt. And if once we get started, we find a greater demand, then we can start installing the 3rd, 4th line. I think that is a very rational approach. So this time, 2 lines and 2 gigawatt each. And the second question, how much are we going to pay as a country? We indicated 2 models. The wheeling cost model. The wheeling cost, the grid tariff will be paid. That will be the payment. 0.1 yen per kilowatt hour. So if the users can pay that amount, then it's viable within TEPCO's region or market. Because of the number of users, it shouldn't be a problem. And with respect to the power revenue income model or generation supplier dedicated line model, well, the transmission businesses include transmission costs will not be borne by the user. There's JPX, and bidding will have to be made to the exchange, or either one-to-one power purchase agreement will have to be struck. So buying at 5 yen, for example, and that 5 yen would include the cost of investment for the interconnection. And by so doing, we're not going to impose an extra higher rate of wheeling for household. 2 gigawatt is not all that small. Well, in one location, you may say it's 2 gigawatt. It can be connected to various places. In projects done in Europe, usually the size is 1 to 1.4 gigawatt. And one interconnector of 1 gigawatt is not there. 0.7 gigawatt per line, usually. So 2 gigawatt. But then utilization rate is going to be very high. And a lot of it will be used. So I don't think gigawatt size itself is all that small. Because it also depends on the rate of utilization. And we're not talking about one single location. If we can connect with both South Korea and Russia, I think there's going to be greater potential. Now, 2 more questions, please.
Someone over here had his or her hand raised, and I think there was another person that way. Wasn't there someone in that direction? Oh, has it gone over there? No, never mind. We'll have three persons raise questions. Muraishi is my name. I was formerly a university professor. I am interested in the nuclear power generation. Mr. Tanaka gave a presentation, and the significance of the international interconnection. I agree with what you have said, but Japan is rather reluctant. I believe it's related to nuclear power generation. TEPCO should abdicate its power with regard to nuclear power generation. I agree with the point you have made. And in your talk, you said you questioned whether there was a way we could be viable with regard to nuclear power generation. And also nuclear technology and maintaining nuclear technology. I am all naturally for this, and I don't know the details about technology. It's just off the top of my head. A national, very high caliber, top quality nuclear technology institute should be created. So businesses in Japan have a complex about doing something like this because they don't think it'll win a lot of support. But I've talked to university professors. They said it was a good idea. Maybe Toshiba, Hitachi, and the highest level technology engineers should be collected to study peaceful use of nuclear energy and decommissioning or power and nuclear energy. If a national institute is created and a national effort is made to do that, I think it would be a good idea. What do you think about this? Please be succinct. The next person, please. My name is Sunaga from IPECO. It's a very heavy subject which was discussed. I am designing data centers that eats up power. 1 gigawatt, 2 gigawatts, it can easily eat this up. So firstly, from Russia to Japan to lay an LNG pipeline in the ocean. Can you really build pipelines? This is something that I'm not really aware of. Like Eurostar, if you can dig a tunnel, you can lay panels. But gas lines, can you really construct that under the sea? And if that's possible, I said that LNG at minus 190 degrees, it will be superconducting, and you can send. In Hokkaido, we have been successful in this effort, and if we extend that over this was a short distance, it was possible. But with regard to LNG, I think this is possible. In Ishikari, you mentioned 2 gigawatts, and Hokkaido Power Company's electricity is very expensive, and Honshu's power is very expensive, so I want cheap electricity. Is that possible? Is it realizable? Third question, please. From Hitachi Limited, from a nuclear power business unit. My name is Yoshimoto. I was originally involved in renewable energy. And with regard to nuclear power, I've been able to hear voices both for and against. My question is addressed to Mr. Tanaka. Honestly speaking, there's a serious dichotomy here in Japan. I am in agreement with you, Mr. Tanaka. If you think about, if you hear the pros and cons, the nuclear wastes and reduction thereof, you can find a consensus. The population is going to be declining. So you don't need a large nuclear power plant. The small SMRs would be sufficient. So you could say that to both, but it's not very compelling. How do you intend to convince? Maybe it's a technical issue. How do you convince people about nuclear power? Thank you very much. If I was intending to talk about that, I ran out of time. There are 3 questions. On the last question, to start with the last question, nuclear technology. What kind of nuclear technology should we possess here in Japan? And an international institute to develop this is an idea in this direction. In Japan, if there is no absolute safety, passive security, or extremely safe, a certain type of reactor, or spent fuel, or high-level nuclear waste amount, the reduction thereof as much as possible, an answer which could cater to this. Even light water reactors produces waste, and we have to get rid of Fukushima debris. We have to find a place for this to reduce the waste, rather than to keep this in Fukushima, not 300,000 years, but 3 million years. If the toxicity goes down, I think that kind of technology would be welcome. A small size SMRs, if that can be developed, it would be good for debris, and it would be good for waste processing. And another point which I mentioned, bringing plutonium from North Korea. If we burn this in a reactor, it's a reactor for burning nuclear weapons and making it harmless. It's for peaceful use of nuclear power to burn nuclear weapons. And the most efficient way of doing this is small-sized reactors. And if we should adopt this as a model, and we should wave the flag of nuclear non-proliferation of nuclear. We should promote the peaceful use. We have experienced Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and we would like to maintain nuclear power for peaceful use. And this would be a pillar for diplomacy. It's not kowtowing to the United States. As one who has experienced the atomic bomb, what can Japan do as a peace-loving nation? I believe that this is the technology that can be leveraged. If we can try to convince the public, I don't know whether we can garner support. If nuclear is to remain viable, this is the only way we can do it. And this technology is such that the government has to take responsible. A national institute, JAEA, is an organization which exists. Maybe an entity such as JAEA can properly address this subject. This technology is U.S. technology, Argonne Laboratory. It's an Idaho-born technology which was already used, and development has ended with regard to this. It's complete. Hitachi, Toshiba, Mitsubishi, the companies that have the capacity and the skills, if we can work together with them, then the complexes toward nuclear power will be dispelled. And those who want to do this, we can maintain the pool of talented people who can do this sort of thing. And I believe this is the path that Japan should take in terms of nuclear. And there was a question on the pipeline. I'd like to talk about this with regard to power as well. It's not LNG, but it's natural gas. LNG is carried by ships, by vessels. The submarine gas pipelines are quite possible. It exists in Europe. But the problem is if it is built too deep in the sea, the diameter has to become smaller. So if it's very deep under the Black Sea, there's a pipeline which can span 2,000 meters, and we can bring it to Japan. In Japan, the depth is 3,000 meters, so it's very difficult. But from Sakhalin to Hokkaido, from Hokkaido to Honshu, near the coast, if we can lay pipelines, it's not a difficult thing to do. what you've mentioned earlier, as a power line, the superconducting technology to be used where losses is zero. Of course, such a method is possible. Japan is most advanced in terms of this technology. But what China is doing is direct current, high voltage transmission, and the superconducting line, which is more advanced, is in the future possible, but the cost is still very high. And in due course, however, interconnection, considering this, is technically possible.
Thank you. I wonder why we started to talk about nuclear power, but I've been in this industry for over 20 years, actually 26 years. Since 26 years ago, we've been talking about SMRs. During this time, the greatest progress, as has been said so many times, is the renewables. The cost of renewables has come down so drastically 26 years ago, and I don't really want to remember how expensive it was. So 10 million yen of a cost to install renewable panels in a household, but cost is much lower today. I was talking with a Chinese person. One module is 1 yuan. 1 yuan is 16 yen. So 16,000 yen per kilowatt hour in terms of the system's cost, just hundreds of thousands of yen. So 1/100th of the cost 26 years ago. And so combine it with red oil, make it untouchable. That's been discussed since the President Clinton days, and this is a theological discussion, so I won't delve into that. But the greatest change that is happening today, right under our nose, is the low cost of renewables. In several years' time, the cost could be brought down to nil. So we're going to conclude, but anything that you would like to say? Yes? Well, it's up to the Japanese government how it's going to take action. There are three things. What is often said is that Japanese government is vulnerable to external pressure. So when foreign countries exert pressure on Japan, Japan may change. And when other people start, we tend to follow. And Japan all of a sudden starts to take action. So when Japan sees that Korea, China, and Russia started to move, then Japan will start to take action. And the market forces, voices from the market, voices from consumers, the Japanese government will have to listen to them. They have no other option but to listen to them. So three forces I mentioned. We need as many as three forces, but one may be enough to achieve a breakthrough. And so I would, of course, like to continue my efforts. But then I would like to call upon the people in the market, the people in the press, people in the government. If you can buy into this, please raise your voices. Thank you.
改めてですね、パネリストの方。
Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you could please give a round of applause to the panelists, and Ito-san, if you could please conclude.
以上をもち
With this, we conclude the Asia International Grid Connection Study Group's second report lecture. We'd like to thank you very much for coming despite the hot weather.